He screamed until his voice peeled off with the rest of his skin. The vat hissed as another pocket of air escaped beneath his flesh. Muscles convulsed. Steam rolled off the surface in greasy waves, carrying with it the stench of meat and metal. Somewhere beneath the bubbling water, his limbs thrashed. Useless now, tied in iron chains that ensured he could drown but not sink. They wanted him to float. They wanted him to last. They said his name was Richard. He'd been a cook. But by now even that word felt blasphemous. He had once boiled broth for bishops. Now he was the broth, simmering in a cauldron large enough to hold a corpse upright, his body rising and falling as if begging the surface for air, or mercy, or death. None came. Death was too fast. This was justice. Designed. A boy in the crowd vomited into his own hands. A woman looked away but didn't move. One man murmured a prayer, though no one could hear it over the screams. The executioner didn't lift a sword. He stirred. This was not a beheading. This was not a hanging. There was no sudden crack of a spine, no flash of the axe. Just the slow, steady bloom of horror. His skin blistered first, then it turned waxy, then it split open like paper soaked in oil. Somewhere beneath the agony, he understood. They weren't killing him because he poisoned someone. That was the excuse. They were killing him like this because it needed to be remembered. His crime wasn't murder. His crime was betrayal, a quiet creeping death delivered through food, a servant corrupting the sacred trust between the nobility and those who fed them. And so now his body was the sermon. No gallows could deliver this kind of message. No axe could whisper this kind of fear into a crowd. But this was theatre, and it was meant to teach. The longer he lived, the better the lesson. Witnesses would later say his eyes never closed, that even as his lips sloughed off and his fingers turned to pulp, those eyes kept darting, scanning the crowd, searching for help, for forgiveness, for someone to wake him from whatever nightmare had unspooled and dropped him, screaming into this pit of fire and water. But there was no waking, only boiling, only silence once the body stopped moving and the water was still. Only the smell that lingered, sweet, sour, unmistakable. Only the message, etched in steam and flesh. Betrayal doesn't just die, it suffers. It started, as all great fears do, at the dinner table. A man of rank, cloaked in velvet, surrounded by silver, lifts a spoon to his lips and never lowers it again. His throat tightens, his pupils shrink, and suddenly the power that stretched across lands and laws collapses into a convulsion. No knives drawn, no assassins caught climbing castle walls, no army of rebels, just soup. This was the terror that lived in every nobleman's cup, treason that left no wound. Poison was the weapon of the invisible. It didn't shout, it whispered. It snuck past guards and gates and reputations. It came laced in honey, stirred in wine, kneaded into bread. And it could come from anyone, a servant, a lover, a child. The hand that killed you might be the same hand that dressed you that morning. To rulers obsessed with loyalty, poison wasn't just a crime, it was blasphemy, because it blurred the line between servant and master, between trust and death. You could spot a blade. You could not taste betrayal until it was already inside you, and that made it unforgivable. In the year 1531, England codified that fear into law. Under Henry VIII, a new punishment emerged for poisoners. Not hanging, not the axe, but boiling alive. Not because it was more effective, but because it was louder. Because when a man dies quietly in his cell, no one learns. But when he dies screaming in steam, the kingdom listens. And it wasn't just about pain, it was about the kind of pain. Boiling was slow. It punished the body with patience. It dragged the soul out in pieces. Because if poison was treason done silently, then its punishment needed to be deafening. Richard Roose, the cook who boiled in chapter 1, didn't kill a king. He didn't even kill a lord. But he killed a bishop's guest, and that was enough. Because what he really murdered was security. What he shattered was the illusion that power could protect itself from within. Suddenly, every meal became a risk. Every servant a suspect. If a cook could kill, what about the maid, the groom, the physician? A nobleman could no longer sit to eat without tasting fear. And so the punishment had to be not just public, but theatrical. The monarchy needed to remind the kingdom, loyalty is not optional, and disloyalty will not be clean. Thus, a pot of water became a court, a flame became a judge, and a body, its skin curling, its eyes wide, its mouth open in a scream that would never echo far enough, became the law. He was just the cook, not a knight, not a priest, not a nobleman with enemies, just a man with flour on his sleeves and broth beneath his fingernails. Richard Roose wasn't born to make history, he was born to make dinner. The kind of man whose name no one remembers unless it's burned into lore or boiled into legend. Before they called him a poisoner, they called him nothing at all. He worked in the kitchens of Bishop John Fisher, a respected cleric and thorn in the side of King Henry VIII. Roose's job was simple: prepare meals, follow orders, remain invisible. And he did, until one Lenten afternoon in 1531, when something slipped into the pottage. The guests who ate it collapsed. One died, others were violently ill. The bishop survived. He hadn't eaten that day, but someone had cooked it. Roose was arrested immediately. There was no investigation, no defence, just an assumption that betrayal had simmered in the pot, and that he had stirred it. He protested, of course, said it was a joke, a mistake, perhaps even the devil's doing. But it didn't matter, because England didn't need a trial. It needed a scapegoat. Within days, Parliament passed a new law specifically for him, the 1531 Act for Poisoning. It declared that any man who killed by poison would be boiled alive, not as a criminal, as a traitor. And it applied retroactively, meaning Richard Roose became the first person in English history to be legally boiled by royal decree. He wasn't sentenced, he was declared, as if he were no longer a man but a plague, a contagion that needed to be purged by fire and spectacle. The press didn't call him Richard, they called him the Poisoner. One word, no past, no wife, no friends, just the act. That's how dehumanisation works. It strips the story down to a single detail, then lights it on fire. In the records, there's no mention of his final meal, no note of who escorted him to the cauldron, just the fact that the water was waiting. And this is the part we forget. Roose was never proven guilty. There was no evidence, no confession under oath, just accusation and panic. In a time of fear, that was enough. It always is. He may have been innocent, he may have been guilty, but by the time the crowd gathered to watch his body flinch and rupture beneath the bubbling surface, it didn't matter. Because he was no longer Richard Roose, he was the reason nobles feared their dinner. And fear doesn't require truth, it just needs someone to burn. The law came after the pot had already started to bubble. Parliament moved quickly, not because justice demanded it, but because fear did. In the days following the poisoning, whispers curled through the halls of power like smoke. What if it happens again? What if it's the wine next time? The communion? The thought that death could be swallowed as easily as supper stirred something darker than outrage. It stirred paranoia, and paranoia is a fertile ground for cruelty. The law Henry VIII signed wasn't written to restore order. It was written to announce dominance. Officially, it bore the name An Act for Poisoning. Unofficially, it was a royal scream. It declared that poisoning was no longer simple murder. It was high treason, a direct assault on the Crown's authority, and the punishment would be boiling alive, not death, destruction. This was not a punishment crafted from legal precedent. It had no lineage. It emerged fully formed, like a hammer made of steam and vengeance. England had never executed anyone this way before, not legally. This wasn't justice with its eyes blindfolded. This was a king staring straight into your soul and daring you to cross him. Henry VIII knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't just want a man to die for a crime. He wanted that man's death to enter the bloodstream of the kingdom, to etch itself into memory, to haunt kitchens and castles, to make every servant hesitate, every lord think twice, every onlooker absorb the message in the hiss of rising steam. This is what betrayal tastes like. The wording of the law was cold. It authorised boiling in water or other liquid substance. No specification of temperature, no duration, just the method, a slow, liquefying horror, where the flesh surrendered inch by inch. This wasn't justice. This was anatomy undone as punishment. Because boiling doesn't just kill, it changes. It warps the human form, peels the skin in layers, turns muscle to paste, bone to sludge. It forces the body to endure its own unravelling while the soul remains locked inside, screaming, dissolving, pleading for an end that refuses to arrive. And that's why the law existed, not to protect the powerful, but to scare everyone else. It was never used often. It didn't need to be. Its genius was in its rarity. Like a plague or a miracle, it only had to happen once for its legend to take hold. The boiling of Richard Roose became myth overnight, his crime and his punishment feeding into each other like fire into kindling. Other kings had written laws to control men, but Henry wrote one to boil them alive, to make the pain linger long after the flames died down, to make the body the battlefield and the soul the casualty. And in that bubbling pot, he found something more powerful than death. He found obedience. The cauldron was already waiting when they dragged him into Smithfield. It stood in the square like a promise. Iron-bellied, soot-streaked, mounted over a crackling fire that had been burning since dawn. The air stank of ash and hot metal. Men shuffled nervously. Children perched on shoulders. Vendors sold cider to calm the stomach. And at the centre of it all, the water simmered. Not boiling yet, but close. They'd timed it carefully. This wasn't to be an execution. It was to be a demonstration. They brought Richard Roose in, shackled barefoot, stripped to the waist. His skin already pale from days in the tower. No hood, no priest. Just 2 guards and a rope. His eyes scanned the crowd. Not with defiance, but with disbelief. This couldn't be real. He'd begged for the axe, even the gallows, but the king had been clear. He would boil. The pot, now beginning to hiss, was filled not just with water, but oil, pitch and resin. Substances chosen for their density, their cling, their ability to stay hot and stick to the flesh. When the fire beneath it was stoked, the surface quivered, slick and silver, like the skin of something alive. At the base of the cauldron was a platform, just high enough to keep his head above water. That was part of the design. They didn't want him to die too quickly. The goal wasn't to drown him, it was to scald him in layers. They lifted him by the arms. He screamed, not because of pain, not yet, but because he finally understood. He wasn't being placed into the pot. He was being lowered, slowly, inch by inch. The crowd went quiet. The first touch of heat hit his feet and he jerked violently. Chains rattled. Guards held fast. His skin reddened, then blistered, then began to peel before he even reached the knees. The liquid clung like molten sap, and still they lowered him. By the time it reached his waist, he was no longer begging. He was howling. Not words, just sound. Primitive, primal. The kind of scream that makes birds scatter and stomachs clench. And still they lowered him. Hands, arms, chest. His skin began to separate from muscle. Beneath the scalding oil, fat rose and pooled like wax melting from a candle. His fingers bloated. His lips cracked. One eye swelled shut, then they stopped. Held him there, mid-boil, for nearly 2 minutes. The surface bubbled around his ribs. He trembled, convulsed, tried to scream but could only gurgle. The pain was not just on the outside anymore. It was inside, in his lungs, his bones, his teeth. And the people watched. Some clutched their mouths. Others wept. A few turned away, but no one left. Because this wasn't just punishment, it was politics. Every face in the crowd was meant to remember. This is what treason feels like from the inside out. Then they lowered him again. Final descent. His chin dipped beneath the surface. He thrashed once, then again, and then nothing. Silence, save for the gentle hiss of steam and the crackle of wood beneath iron. The body remained in the pot long after the soul had fled. They didn't pull him out. They let him steep. Flesh darkened, bones loosened, eyeballs collapsed inward. The liquid turned reddish-black and smelled like cooked meat. Eventually, they extinguished the fire. Not out of mercy, but necessity. The king had made his point. And in that square, once the site of sermons and fairs, Richard Roose had become a warning in human form. How to boil a man alive? Publicly, slowly, and with enough heat that no one ever forgot the sound of his scream beneath the lid. They came early, before the fire had caught, before the pot had begun to sweat. Men brought their sons. Women clutched their daughters close. The execution square became a market of anticipation. Vendors sold meat pies and tankards of ale. Pickpockets drifted through the crowd like minnows in a tide. A boy hoisted onto his father's shoulders asked what time the screaming would start, and no one thought that strange. They had heard the rumours. Boiling. Not a hanging. Not a swing of the axe. Not a clean end, but something new. Something designed to last. They didn't come to see justice. They came to watch a man be unmade. When the smoke began to rise, the crowd grew restless. The cauldron hissed. Somewhere, someone laughed. Somewhere else, someone vomited. But no one left, because this was more than execution. This was participation. An entire community gathered to stare down one man's horror and remind themselves, this is what order looks like. And in that moment, pain became entertainment. Misery became reassurance. When Richard Roose screamed, the sound crawled up the walls of the square like a living thing. Mothers clapped hands over their children's ears, then peeked through their fingers. Vendors stopped calling out prices, mouths half open, eyes fixed on the boiling surface. Some in the back climbed onto barrels and crates, desperate to glimpse the man becoming less than human. Because something happens when torture becomes public. It becomes a mirror. Some watched in horror, unable to look away. Others leaned in, hungry. There were those who cried, and those who smiled. And somewhere in between, most of them, stood in stunned silence, absorbing the message, not with reason but with flesh. They weren't being entertained. They were being disciplined. This wasn't about Richard Roose. This wasn't even about poison. It was about the idea that order could melt a man down until nothing was left but obedience. That control didn't live in laws or kings, but in the memory of what happened when you crossed them. When the boiling stopped, the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't weep. They just dispersed like birds after a storm, quietly, slowly. Children asked questions. Some adults gave answers. Most didn't. No one dared speak too loudly, because what they had witnessed wasn't just death. It was a lesson. And lessons, when written in steam and agony, echo longer than any sermon. Some would dream of it for years. The hiss, the smell, the sudden silence when the body went limp. Some would return to that square months later and still taste the smoke in their mouths. And some, perhaps many, would one day whisper to their own children, "I was there. I saw him die." Not because they wanted to remember, but because they couldn't forget. He was gone, but the body remained. Long after the last scream had dissolved into the smoke, after the twitching stopped, after the crowd had begun to murmur and shift their weight, Richard Roose was still in the pot, still floating in the oil-darkened broth of his own unmade. The fire hissed low beneath the cauldron, but it hadn't been put out. Not yet. That wasn't part of the script, because this wasn't an execution that ended with death. This was a spectacle, and the body was part of the staging. It bobbed slightly in the water, barely human now. The skin, where it hadn't peeled off entirely, had turned a sickly white and split apart like overcooked meat. His hands curled inward. His jaw hung open. His eyes, once wide with confusion, had melted back into the skull. And still no one touched him, because he wasn't the point. What mattered now was what he had become. An object, a warning, a moment in time rendered in human tissue. The king had ordered boiling because it lingered, not just in the body but in the memory, and so they let him steep, let the heat rise just a little longer, let the smell of rendered fat and charred hair cling to the hems of the onlookers' cloaks, to the wood beams of nearby shops, to the throats of the children too young to understand but too old to ever forget. His screams were not his own anymore. They belonged to the crowd, to the men who needed reminding, to the women expected to stay quiet, to the servants who brought trays into noble halls and now looked twice at the food before they dared serve it. Boiling had never been about justice. It was about ritual, a burning rite of purification. His pain was the innocence, his destruction, the offering. There is something particularly brutal in turning a human body into a prop, not just killing it, but using it, displaying it, letting it hang in that moment between motion and stillness so that everyone around it must decide what they see, a man or a message. And the silence that followed was not peace, it was obedience. No sermon needed, no royal proclamation. The bubbling body said enough. That day in Smithfield, the law didn't speak in words. It spoke in steam, in skin that split and curled, in the way the guards stood back from the cauldron, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, in the way the fire was allowed to burn just a little longer than necessary. The body wasn't removed until dusk. By then, most of the crowd had gone. The square was quiet again, but the air still trembled. The spectacle was over, but its echo had only begun. It should have spread. That was the king's intention. A new law, a new terror, a new tool in the arsenal of royal control. If one boiling could silence a city, then more could drown a nation in obedience. But that never happened, because even the machinery of death has its limit. The law remained, inked into the statutes, crisp in its language. Boiling alive was now the legal punishment for poisoners, and yet it was rarely used. Not because mercy returned, but because something darker had crept into the minds of those who dealt in death. Even executioners hesitated, the men who had swung axes clean through necks, the ones who had watched the light drain from eyes without flinching, the ones who knew exactly how to knot a rope to snap a spine at just the right moment. Even they recoiled from the pot, because boiling did not feel like punishment, it felt like desecration. There is a script to execution, a rhythm, a choreography of ritual and result. The condemned kneels, the blade falls, the noose tightens. It is brutal, yes, but it is structured, predictable, contained. There is distance between the killer and the killed, but boiling offered no such distance. It removed the barrier. You could smell it, hear it. You had to watch it unfold, second by second, as a man ceased to be a man. There was no clean separation between crime and consequence. There was only liquefaction, the slow collapse of skin, dignity, an identity into something that made the onlookers question their own humanity. One executioner, an anonymous man whose name was never recorded, reportedly refused to perform a second boiling. He claimed that the screams followed him, not just in sleep, but in daylight, that he could still hear the bubbling in his ears when he passed water boiling in a kitchen, that the smell had soaked into his hands. He hanged men instead. He said he preferred it. It was quicker, quieter, less like watching someone be born in reverse. The discomfort wasn't just personal, it was public. Each boiling drew fewer crowds, not because people didn't want to see it, but because they couldn't bear to see it again. The first time was horror, the second, complicity, and that perhaps was the deepest wound. There's something uniquely disturbing about a punishment that punishes everyone who witnesses it, not through guilt, but through proximity, through the sheer intimacy of it, through the reality that what was happening in that pot wasn't distant, wasn't abstract. It was flesh, their flesh. Boiling was a crime against the body itself, and it made everyone who watched feel like they were next. So the pot cooled, the law faded. It was never officially repealed, but it was quietly ignored, like a memory too sharp to touch, like a ghost that sat silently in the corner of the room. Boiling alive had done its job too well. It hadn't just punished the guilty, it had traumatized the machine. The statute remained. Long after the pot cooled, long after the crowd forgot the taste of smoke, the law still lingered in the bones of the... It sat quietly on the books, untouched, unspoken, unrepealed, a clause in the tangled thicket of England's justice system that declared, with surgical clarity, that to poison a meal was to forfeit your own flesh to the fire. But no one taught it in classrooms. No plaques marked the place in Smithfield where the iron cauldron once boiled a man into memory. No dramatizations recreated the moment. No textbooks lingered over the words. To be boiled to death without benefit of clergy. The phrase reads like fiction now, but it was law. It was policy. It was real. And yet, it vanished. Not with ceremony, not with revision, but with avoidance. We chose not to look. We turned the page. We told ourselves that English justice had always been about the noose, the block, the scaffold. Death that arrived in a straight line, clean and narratable. But the truth was messier, more liquid. It hissed and foamed and peeled away at the myths we like to wrap around civilization. Boiling didn't fit the story. It was too crude, too foreign, too barbaric for the self-image of a nation that fancied itself above such things. And so it was quietly erased, not by denial, but by silence. But the silence was a choice, because to remember the boiling is to remember that justice has always had a theatrical streak. That law can be molten. That punishment is not always about consequence, but about control. And that there was once a moment when England cooked a man alive, not in a dungeon, not in secret, but in front of its children, its clergy, its noblemen, and its vendors, and called it law? Even now the echoes remain, in every headline that thirsts for spectacle, in every system that sacrifices humanity for order, in every forgotten statute that still hums beneath the surface, waiting to be seen. The law that made boiling alive a sentence was eventually repealed, not because it was wrong, but because it was remembered too clearly. It haunted the edges of legal debate. It made polite society uncomfortable. It was a scar that refused to fade, and so it was buried, not with dignity, but with discomfort. But it never burned out, because once a nation has watched a man scream from the inside, it never really forgets. It just learns how to close its eyes.